This is Politics Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning. Julia Davis is a columnist for the Daily Beast and the creator of Russian Media Monitor. She's an expert on the Russian media itself, what state television stations and other channels in Russia say to the people who live there. We talked to her about how the Russian media has portrayed Russia's military action and violence in Ukraine, the narratives the state has offered to justify this to its people, and how people have responded. Like all of our episodes, this is an edited version of a much longer conversation that was taped live with audience questions. For information on how to join us or past episodes, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever podcast streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode on Wednesday featuring Stephen Wertheim of the Quincy Institute. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
Can you tell us about your career and how you actually got into being a Russian media watcher?
Well, I was born and raised in Ukraine, and I lived half of my life there. And then I moved to the United States, where I worked in the film industry with my husband for many years. And then I went on to become a screenwriter and a journalist reporter. So basically, I've done a whole lot of things. And when Putin invaded Ukraine in 2014 and annexed Crimea, it became quite obvious to me that the Russian propaganda and the way they twist things and the way they intentionally lie and misrepresent things was not being covered in our media, not extensively anyway. And a lot of times I would even see Western media just run with Russian talking points without questioning whether they're real or not, as sort of a both sides operation. But they're not good faith actors. So you can't do that. You can't just take their word for it. So I have created the Russian Media Monitor at that point, and I started debunking Russian lies and propaganda. And I've created multiple collections, 20 in each, where I gave examples, visual examples of how they lie. And it actually explains a lot of their motivation as well. And their propaganda always has a motive behind it. And a lot of their propaganda starting in 2014 up till present date was actually designed to work towards the scenario we're witnessing right now, which is Putin's designs on all of Ukraine. So to answer your first question, that's how I got into it, basically.
I'm wondering, though, if you could take us through how Russians get their news. What are the most watched news channels and most read papers in the country? And is there a great diversity of thought in that ecosystem?
Putin figured out early on that media was very powerful in terms of shaping public opinion and controlling the narratives that are prevalent in Russian society. So pretty early in his rule, so to speak, he had taken control over media and slowly but surely had eliminated most independent outlets in Russia. So most of the people in Russia get their news from one of the state media channels like Russia 1, Russia 24. Those are the most popular ones, but they're popular just because there's really not that much of a choice left. They were small independent outlets like TV Rain and Echo of Moscow, but in the run up to the Ukraine war, and then as it happened, because they were the only ones willing to call war a war, which is now prohibited in Russia, they're not allowed to call it war or invasion, they were taken off air at all. So the landscape was already pretty controlled in the past, but at least they had those independent outlets and also obviously internet where they can search for information and social media where they could also see information. But all of that has been basically eliminated or is about to be cut off. So people are being completely left in the ecosystem where only Putin's side of this invasion, which he's trying to present as not an invasion, is actually pretty Orwellian the way they're presenting it. But the Russians are being basically cut off from being able to get news independently.
Julia, what about the major foreign publishers? These big international news brands like the BBC and CNN, how many of them are still active in Russia? And how much has that changed since the invasion in the last month?
They're being forced out of Russia. I believe I saw that BBC still intends to continue working, but their lives are being made impossible. A lot of outlets are being forced out of the country. I saw New York Times is pulling their reporters out of there. The Radio Europe, Radio Freedom, all of them are being forced to leave. So it's basically bare bones there as to what is still remaining.
So, in the period before this recent enormous escalation, when these publishers have been forced out of the country, for the last 10 years, how much kind of freedom and latitude did those foreign journalists have inside the country? And did they have an audience in Russia? Were they able to shape perceptions and influence opinions in the period before the recent invasion?
More or less to those that were interested in learning the truth. But there again, for the last number of years, especially after the annexation of Crimea, the government and the media that is essentially operating as Putin's mouthpiece has been calling anyone that is looking for the truth anywhere other than the state media, they've been branded as traitors or people that are not loyal to their nation or their government. So people were actively discouraged from reading news at those outlets, and they have branded them foreign agents, not only actual foreign outlets, but also anyone that has been independently reporting. They also label them foreign agents based on an assumption that there's no way that they could possibly have this alternative opinion and therefore must have been funded by the West, even in instances where there's absolutely no proof of that.
Vladimir Putin has closed down almost all the independent TV outlets in Russia, stifling any dissenting voices. Instead, Russians can watch a niche channel called Star TV that is owned and operated by the Russian military. Putin started laying the groundwork for his present Ukraine offensive. It began last July with an astonishing 5,000-word personal essay in Russian newspapers that reviewed 1,000 years of Russian history, suggesting that Ukraine was not a real country and even that the Ukrainian language was not a real language.
In Vladimir Putin's rambling war declaration on Thursday morning, he threw everything at the wall in hopes something might stick. And I quote, "We will seek to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine." Later, he addressed Ukrainian soldiers directly, saying, quote, "Your fathers, grandfathers, and great-grandfathers did not fight the Nazi occupiers and did not defend our common motherland to allow today's neo-Nazis to seize power in Ukraine."
So I wanted to kind of move into what the Russian media has been telling their citizens up to and through the beginning of the invasion. And specifically, Julia, I want to get your take on what have been the most effective propaganda narratives by Putin and the Russian media to build support for this war with everyday Russians.
Well, this effort started shortly after the annexation of Crimea. In the build-up to that, they already started to represent the popular uprising and the revolution as something that the West has organized. So there was a huge movement at that point to discredit Ukraine and malign it in any way possible. And so they have come up with this fairy tale that if they didn't take the Crimea, the Ukrainian Nazis were planning to go there and start just randomly killing all Russian speakers there. So they have created this idea even way back when. For years since then, they have perpetrated the same narrative that Ukraine is both Nazi and Western controlled. And they've actually discussed the intent, which we now know really was the intent, but they've discussed for years taking all of Ukraine, not just the Crimea, not only East Ukraine. And I have written about it. They've been quite specific as early as maybe 3 years ago. And I've constantly put that in my articles when they articulated that they want all of Ukraine. And they were threatening that if there was any resistance, they wouldn't hesitate to use targeted nuclear strikes. And they believed the West was impotent to stop them. So, this entire time, there was this persistent focus on most of their programs, which talk very little about what's going on in Russia other than praising the government. But it was mainly focused, half of the program they'd be talking about Ukraine, the other half about the West, both of them actively brainwashing their audiences to vilify both Ukraine and the West and to perpetrate this idea that Ukraine is Nazi run, although it's just completely invented. As I'm sure you know, the president is Jewish, and there is not a single Nazi in the actual Ukrainian government. So it's just completely invented. For all these years, they've been building up to this. So now, to them, I guess that seems like a smooth transition where Putin all of a sudden decided invade all of Ukraine because it supposedly needs to be liberated from the Nazis. For years, they've been working this theory, but still, their people are not inclined to believe it because there are such tight links between Russia and Ukraine. People would travel, they would study in both places. Most families are mixed between Russians and Ukrainians. So they knew that Ukraine is not actually ran by a Nazi government. So this is why they're now starting to come up with new theories with these nuclear threats, supposedly, that Ukraine was planning to build a dirty nuclear bomb to attack Russia, that Ukraine was going to attack Russia on March the 8th, and Putin just barely beat them. How fortunate that he went in first, because otherwise Ukraine would attack them. And then, of course, the other story about the so-called biolabs ran by the United States in Ukraine, as they say, and I've written about that since I think in 2018 or 2019 when I've written about that before, where fear mongering on their part, where they were claiming that the United States and Ukraine are developing bio weapons to attack Russia. So all of this is culminating now, and I guess they thought that after so many years of being brainwashed, people would accept this idea that it was inevitable they had to go in and take all of Ukraine. And still, most people were caught off guard. Most people thought they would invade just to take Donbass, just the eastern Ukraine. In spite of these years of buildup, and nobody thought he would actually do it because it's a deeply insane idea.
So, what is the level of public support for your average everyday Russian citizens for the invasion of Ukraine? Does the war have widespread support after these near decade of propaganda building it up?
Well, it's pretty hard to estimate because the polls taken inside authoritarian dictatorships are not exactly reliable. Many people might say that they're supporting it just to avoid getting in trouble. From the polls that I have seen, which are pretty tentative, it was about 60%, I believe, that were in support, supposedly. I imagine the number is much lower than that in reality, but there's no way to independently measure it.
So, Julia, looking at these other interventions and conflicts that Russia have been involved in the last 10 years or more, we can look at the 2008 invasion of Georgia, the 2014 annexation of the Crimea, and then the ongoing proxy war in the Donbass, the 2015 intervention into Syria. How much public support do you think there was for those interventions? And do you think that this is being perceived differently from any of those in the past?
This is definitely being perceived differently. Syria, I don't think many people there really cared. It was kind of far away. They were mainly in support. With Georgia, it was presented that Georgia is the one that attacked them, and therefore, that was okay. And they only ended up taking a little bite out of it. So that was pretty well supported. The Crimea enjoyed a lot of support, but things are very different now because I'm hearing even big time pundits and experts on Russian state TV, they don't dare to criticize Putin because they don't want to be shoved out of the window. But they are saying what a shame it is that the West managed to do this, that the West managed to make us fight our brotherly nation. So they're indirectly criticizing the idea of Russia fighting against Ukraine without accepting any accountability for it as the ones that have agitated for years for this. Although I guess they didn't think that it would actually happen beyond eastern Ukraine, which they, of course, always believed that Russia would take. But I'm hearing a lot of criticism in that way, but they're, of course, framing it as something that NATO made them do it. But they don't like the idea of Russia being at war with Ukraine, which, of course, they can't even call war.
So, Julia, how much does public opinion and public support matter for Vladimir Putin's decision making? Do you think that he had a lot of confidence that this invasion would be popular? And you think that that might have in any way informed his decision to escalate in the way that he did?
I don't think that he concerned himself too much with public support because, first of all, he controls public opinion the way he sees it for the most part through the state media that tells them what to think. And secondly, it's an authoritarian police state where people who dare to protest get beaten up, imprisoned, have their lives ruined. So he controls them either through propaganda or through oppression. So I don't think he worries too much about public opinion, just to the point where his state media is putting out the narratives for the people to obediently swallow. But he thought this would be fast and easy. And I've heard they're rationalizing before they invaded. They already talked about how it would take them no more than 10 to 11 minutes to take over all of Ukraine, that there would be no resistance, that the Ukrainians would be meeting them with pies and flowers, and that the West, based on the reaction to Crimea and the subsequent Trump years, they thought there would be some small sanctions again, and they'd be frowned upon for a little bit, and then the West would move on and things would be normal, and they would end up having a whole other piece of land to themselves, and Ukraine subjugated, at least to the point of just the eastern Ukraine. But their rationale was that this would be fast and easy, and the West is too weak and doesn't want to alienate Russia, of course, because of their nuclear weapons, which they like to threaten everyone with. So that was the rationale. Of course, that's not what happened.
And that is not what happened. By all the accounts that you just listed out, the Ukrainian people are putting up one hell of a fight. How has the Russian media reacted to the losses, to the failure, to this campaign not going as the propaganda narrative said it would? Have they been forced to change their narrative on the fly? Have they been doubling down? What does that look like for Putin's propaganda machine?
Just like Putin, they never backtrack, they always double down. They don't admit the casualties, they have only admitted under 500 dead, which of course is a far cry from the losses that they're experiencing. And they have actually used mouthpieces like Douglas McGregor, who is constantly invited on Fox News, who's trashing Ukraine, claiming they're lying about everything, that they're not winning, they're losing, and that Russia is being too delicate with them. So they take clips from that and they run it on the Russian state media channels to say, see, even Americans know that we're only going slow because we're being delicate. And they're quoting McGregor again to say that if Russia wants to, it will turn Ukraine into a meat grinder. And they're announcing that as their most likely next step. And that's why they're arranging these so called ceasefires and saying that they're allowing civilians to evacuate, because after that's over, they will claim that all that's left in Ukrainian towns and cities are just the Nazis. And then at least that's what their experts are predicting. And I hate to say it that way, but it certainly seems plausible that they will then go for those Chechnya or Syria tactics, and it'll be brutal and bloody.
So, Julia, even if the average Russian doesn't know what's happening in the war and doesn't care about what happens to Ukrainians or protesters, something that they surely know about and are noticing, and something that they surely care about and are affected by, is the commercial boycott of Russia and the economic fallout. We're talking about the withdrawal of popular brands from the Russian market, things like Pepsi, Starbucks, McDonald's, and also the impact of the sanctions regime and what that's doing to the Russian currency, people's investments, the rules that banks have to put in about withdrawals. How do you think that the Russian public are responding to this? And are they placing any of the blame for these consequences at the feet of the leadership?
What the state media is telling them is that the sanctions would have been imposed whether or not they did anything in Ukraine. It's, of course, ludicrous and false on its face, but that's what they're trying to sell them, that they would be sanctioned no matter what, because the West is jealous of Russia, because Russia is so big and mighty and powerful, and that's why they're being sanctioned, because the West is against them. There again, what I'm hearing on state TV, even extremely pro-Putin pundits are criticizing what happened. They actually went so far as to say that our government is impotent, and why did we get involved in this if we weren't ready? We should have been building up our economy for 10, 15 years prior so that we could withstand these sanctions. And they actually went directly at Putin and said that he's been telling people that the most important thing is rising prosperity. And how is he going to articulate it now that the prosperity is about to be gone? So they're definitely unsettled by that. They couldn't care less, at least the state media personalities could not care less about the casualties in Ukraine, but they certainly are very concerned about the way this hit them in the pocket. And also, a lot of them are rich. And like one state TV host just had his 2 Italian villas confiscated from him to the tune of approximately $8 million. So they are pretty rattled by that. No one saw the magnitude of sanctions that they were hit with. And I'm sure Putin himself was also caught off guard by that.
If Russia attacks Ukraine, it will be met with overwhelming international condemnation. The world will not forget that Russia chose needless death and destruction. Invading Ukraine will prove to be a self-inflicted wound. The United States and our allies and partners will respond decisively. The West is united and galvanized. Today, our NATO allies and the alliance is as unified and determined as it has ever been. And the source of our unbreakable strength continues to be the power, resilience, and universal appeal of our shared democratic values. Because this is about more than just Russia and Ukraine. It's about standing for what we believe in, for the future we want for our world.
Biden had warned them so many times that what they would be facing would be much worse than anything he's seen before. He should have listened. They're all very much rattled by that, and they're anticipating that by April the 1st, when the government can't afford to pay the salaries of police and school teachers and the magnitude of things that they're supposed to be paying out, that it will really hit home. And Russians, I believe, at least at that point, if they're not doing that yet, will start making efforts to find out what really happened, what did they really do to cause a fallout this large.
So, Julia, since you mentioned the rich and elite people in Russia, whether in the media or in the business sector, this is something that I've been kind of curious about, because you've described how the average Russian who doesn't leave the country, who watches state media, is in a sort of bubble with all of these strange perceptions and rationales that don't really make very much sense from an informed outside perspective. So many of these Russian elite figures have lots of contact with the West. People like Roman Abramovich, Mikhail Friedman, they live most of the year abroad. They send their children to American universities and Western universities. They're very engaged with Western culture, investing in things like Chelsea Football Club. But at the same time, they are so close to the Kremlin and they've been supporting Putin for so long. So these kinds of rationales that you've described, that the Russian media use in their narratives, did the elite figures in Russia who support the Kremlin, does this reflect their thinking? Do they actually believe these kinds of things too? People like Abramovich and Friedman, did they buy into the kinds of narratives that the Russian media are promoting?
No, and it was pretty funny to hear Deripaska. I think he wrote it on his Telegram channel asking who is going to pay for this banquet, meaning the war in Ukraine, because they definitely didn't expect to be hit in their pockets. And what they believe, as well as Putin, is that the West is corrupt and you could buy anyone in anything. And this is how, in their mind, they thought they would be safe forever with the Kremlin bashing and attacking and undermining the West, but at the same time, the West being willing to look the other way as long as it had their money. So for them, this is a rude awakening as well.
So, Julia, now we're going to go to the audience for their questions. We are going to start with Andy. Andy, over to you.
Thanks, Justin. Many thanks for joining us today. Julia, great to hear from you. I wonder if you could touch a bit upon the external focused elements of Russian media, for instance, RT Sputnik. Do you think that the bans that were being placed on them were indeed correct? Or do you think that, in fact, they had very little actual impact in the first place? And that, in fact, merely by banning them, we are perhaps fueling certain elements of the Russian narrative?
I think that banning them was the right thing, even though I am for freedom of the press, but they were never meant as a legitimate outlet. In fact, the head of RT herself and also spokeswoman for Russia's foreign ministry, Maria Zakharova, repeatedly described RT as their information weapon to fight information wars against the West. And it was very interesting to hear the head of RT talk about how she wants Russia to be like China, where there is no outside influence, where the internet is cut off from the rest of the world, and there are no foreign media outlets operating there, because she says that that's like having a foreign army in your own country that is constantly attacking you. So if you just turn that around, you could see this is what they were doing here. And they were very insidious in the way they operated, and they intentionally perpetrated agendas to divide, to cause us harm, to cause us damage. And I would hear her laugh about it later on the Russian state TV, talking about how she learned how to attack us by going as an exchange student to the United States, and that they have paid for the education of their essentially nothing less than an enemy that would put a gun to our head later through these media operations. So I think that getting rid of them was a good thing.
Julia, let me follow up here about RT. If you've watched RT and the sort of internationally facing Russian media outlets, as well as the domestically facing Russian media outlets, do you notice any difference in the way that they approach these kinds of stories? Is RT almost a Xerox copy of domestic Russian propaganda, or do they have to craft any slightly different narratives to achieve their purposes to an international audience?
It is starkly different. There's almost nothing in common. Their Western facing outlets avoid overtly calling the West the kind of names they do in their domestic media. And they like to emphasize any kind of protest, any kind of divide across racial lines, very much targeting what they see as America's weaknesses. And the one that they zero in, first of all, is lack of unity. That's what they see as the biggest weakness of the West. And in their domestic coverage, they're a lot more outspoken and calling the West perverted, degenerate, about to fall down, they're about to win, the West is about to disintegrate, which of course they did not say in their English speaking media. And, in the Russian speaking media, they would always talk about how stupid Americans are, how they would believe anything. Of course, they wouldn't say that in English because that's exactly why they thought that they could influence Americans, because they believe that they're ignorant about the rest of the world and they will basically believe anything. Actually, I had RT remove stories of theirs because they were just so outrageous. All of them directed at the English speaking audiences, all of them fully aligning with their narratives that they're now taking with respect to Ukraine, describing the Ukrainian government as Nazis, claiming that they were crucifying babies in town squares, making mothers watch, that they're building concentration camps where they were exterminating Russian speakers. Just outrageous lies and fabrications. And I forced them to delete those segments, which of course I still have copies of, and they are forever burning examples of total deceit and propaganda they've been spreading in the United States.
All right. Thank you very much, Andy and Julia. We are going to go next to Philip. Philip, for the next question. Over to you, sir.
How much of what's happening now is simply a weakness from America to actually lead from the front? Because it seems like we're more in fear of the economy now, of the implications that the war with Russia is now going to have. It seems like people are more worried about that in the West than they're actually worried about the actual prospects of watching a sovereign nation be invaded by Russia, as if we're going back to the Cold War era. I guess, will the United States be forced to pivot on its way that it views these nations and its foreign policy, or do we continue down the road we've been going with, and will the United States become more and more irrelevant towards these things?
Putin is a rational actor. He's both rational and evil, and he's also pretty consistent. The more he's been allowed to act up in the world with little consequences, the more emboldened he became, biting off a piece of Georgia, a piece of Moldova, the slaughter of civilians in Syria, and taking Crimea. He saw the sanctions as weak. As a matter of fact, Obama's sanctions he saw as weak. Then what Trump imposed, they described as shooting a bunch of blanks that were small enough for them to be able to regroup and figure out how to circumvent them, so that they became not as effective as time went on, and they figured out ways around them. And that's what they thought would happen this time as well. I'm glad that we're proving them wrong, but I'm alarmed by the constant assertions that we won't do more for Ukraine because we don't want to fight Russia directly, because there again, that emboldens Putin further, especially this debacle that's happening, unfortunately, in the open with these Polish jets. I'm just horrified that this is playing out for the whole world to see, because this is empowering Putin to let him see that NATO is afraid of him. If you listen to their state media like I do, you know that they are portraying what's going on in Ukraine as them fighting NATO. In fact, they say that all the time. Ukraine is just a proxy. We're here fighting the West. This is our big war against the West. They also argue that NATO is too afraid of them to ever want to be in a conflict with them, and that when they start taking smaller NATO countries, everyone will find out there's no such thing as Article 5. And I think, unfortunately, what's happening right now, and this constant emphasis about how we don't want to fight Russia, we don't want to set off Putin to do worse, I think it's accomplishing the opposite and is emboldening him to think that we're too afraid of him, that once he's done with Ukraine, he can keep on stepping further. So I hope that we will continue to prove him wrong in that regard and prevent him from moving further.
Julie, I just wanted to follow up on that. I think that from my perspective, a lot of the case that Philip kind of outlined is just not true. And especially where we've been discussing Putin's theory of the case. One of the theories would be that there would be weak sanctions. And objectively speaking, the West has really stepped up to the table, first with the SWIFT and then the sanctions on the central bank coming in the same tranche. Now you have the UK, Canada, United States, and other countries directly banning Russian oil imports, despite an election year coming up in 2022, despite prices just skyrocketing. And then if you look at Switzerland, they're now imposing sanctions. You look at what Germany's doing. They've reversed their constitution. They're sending lethal aid. NATO together has sent over 17,000 Javelin arms and anti-tank weapons. Germany is now going to spend over 2% on their national defense, which is a major departure. You have more bellicose language out of Finland, Sweden, and I can keep going on and on and on down the list. So considering those facts of the case, and that the West has very clearly shown that they are willing to support Ukraine at the detriment maybe of their own political fortunes in the near future, has the Russian media been able to take this in and change their narrative at all? Or like everything else, are they just doubling down and still maintaining that NATO and the West are weak despite never seen before level of sanctions and military support?
They're definitely admitting that our sanctions are crushing, that they will be devastating for them. Absolutely. They acknowledge that, and they were caught totally off guard by that, because they have gotten Europe so dependent on their energy imports that they never saw what happened with Nord Stream is even a remote possibility. And they certainly argued that the U.S. would never ban their oil imports either. So it's definitely like a cold shower what they're experiencing right now. They did not see this coming. But the way they comfort themselves and the audiences is to say that Russia is big and important, and once they're done with taking Ukraine, the West will realize how much it also is suffering as a consequence of these sanctions and will start easing them off. And at that point, they will have both Ukraine and relief from sanctions. And it's just a matter of time that they need to hang in there before the West comes back and offers concessions and starts easing off the sanctions. That is what they're presenting to the people, that it's just a matter of time before they get both Ukraine and the relief from sanctions.
That's all we have for you today. Again, huge thanks to Julia and the Daily Beast, to our audience for their questions, and to you for being here. Like all of our episodes, this is an edited version of a much longer conversation that was taped live. For information on how to join us, our past episodes, or to sign up for our very illustrious email newsletter, which will deliver our best of directly to your inbox, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever podcast streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode on Wednesday, featuring Stephen Wertheim of the Quincy Institute. This has been Politics and Media 101, produced in partnership with Clubhouse. I'm Jeff Browning. On behalf of Justin Higgins, our co-founder, and our team, thank you very much for being here. We hope to see you and hear from you soon.